Hi again, everyone. From Cedar Rapids, I'm Bob Ask with my story. My story in the context of history that I lived and studied and taught. Here I am in this picture, my very first day at Jefferson High School. There is that young Jayhawk long time ago. Today, in vignette number 14, I've entitled 1970s, 1980s. We're moving right along decades. Actually, so much developed in my study here in preparation, I've divided it. Today, the context. Next time around, my part of the story in that relationship. So today it's 70s and 80s. I've entitled it Nixon, Carter, Reagan. The context for my story, which will be next time. Today, we're going to look at two things. Part one, the background that is necessary, because a huge political, governmental development came in the 1970s and 80s that we have to take a look at and explain. Part one today is that big development, politically speaking, that is going to impact those three presidents and politics in America ever since. After we give you that historical background, I'm going to quickly go over the three administrations. We're going to give more attention to the background than we are the play-by-play later. This story is such a huge one. It's been by far my most difficult challenge, because here I am going to try to explain and squeeze all that history that had enveloped from the very beginnings of our country, politically, governmentally speaking, into a background for what happens in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Squeeze it all so that will be understandable. Frankly, I almost gave up 2 or 3 times, revising, shortening, revising again, and coming up with what we have today. So we begin with a little history review. We want to remember, first of all, and this is material history that you're well acquainted with, just perhaps a little dusting off review will help. Our government, built on the Constitution at that convention in 1787, is structured around power, authority, who's the boss, where, how, why does governing power to be located. 2 splits came about. We call them in history division of power and separation of power. Division of power. How do you divide the power between the central entity, the federal government, and the subdivisions we call states? Federalism and states' rights. the separation of powers takes that central government and splits it up once again to the three branches: executive, legislature, judicial, making the law, carrying out the law, interpreting and resolving conflicts in the law. Now, when this government was set up then, way back toward the beginning, most power was given to the national government. Centralism, federalism. We had tried the other way around first, confederation government, where the states were the most powerful. The Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress, we had tried all that first, didn't work out. Our country was too weak and was getting shoved around, frankly. So we came to Philadelphia to take a look at that government and ended up with a brand new rendition. Now, from that beginning, voting on whether to have the Constitution or not, and then on, after it was decided, two parties came into existence on questions that would come up thereafter. It started out with Hamilton's party on one side, federalism, and Jefferson's states' rights on the other side, starting out the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, moving on up by other names. You've heard of the Whigs and so forth. Jackson came along on Jefferson's side. That's when they shortened it to Democrat. So eventually we have the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. Now, what was the result of all of that history in between? The North, the majority, was for the central government, and they were the ones that had majority rule. The South became the minority. They had to resort to states' rights, and they had to play defense. As we move into the 1800s thereafter, all along, sectional differences came into play. Two especially, the matter of slavery and the matter of a protective tariff. Slavery, South pro, North against. Tariff, the North wanted the tariff to protect their industries. South didn't like it because that meant England couldn't buy from us, and that's where they had their best customers, which would hurt them, the agrarian section of our country. Why, we almost went to a civil war years before we did, starting in troubled South Carolina over the tariff. So things weren't looking good, and yes, you know the story. Eventually, the South had had enough. Threatened secession, the Civil War in the 1860s. Now, after the Civil War and the end of slavery, we take a look at the South because they become the center of the story. The South, we think of the charm of plantations and cotton fields. We think of the nostalgia of the Swanee River. but we also think of the shame of slavery and secession. To protect their interests and their rights, these developments came along to keep, in other words, white supremacy. They came up with a poll tax, taxing blacks now free. Literacy test, testing blacks at a disadvantage, and came up with the terror of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, here's the big change that came about that needed that background. Big changes. 1965, going into the 1970s and 80s, the Democrats, LBJ, passed civil rights and voting rights laws, a series of them, 64, 65, against discrimination. Discrimination, providing for equality. Now, what did this do? All up to that time, the South had voted as a block of votes to protect their interests. All of that time since the beginning, and now lasting almost a decade long, had developed this voting bloc that we called the Solid Democratic South. It had stayed together from Virginia to Texas until these laws were passed. And now it broke up, and they started to vote against the Democrats who had caused all that change, civil rights and voting, putting the Republicans in play as well as blacks. Things changed when we get to Nixon, Carter, and Reagan. The solid Democrat South that had lasted for so long was gone, and now things were in play. In fact, like one historian put it, Dixie had become almost solid Republican. Those things were in effect when we get to R3. Now, there were other issues that came along too that will have impact that we can't get into. Of course, there were Northerners moving south. There were conservative views on moral, social issues like abortion. They called it the New Right, and Reagan Democrats. All that comes to as well. Now, here quickly are the three. Richard Nixon, who had been vice president for Ike, a lawyer, a congressman from California, who had lost to John F. Kennedy, won in 68 and 72, and we remember him, how? Well, he was so good against holding our own against China. Made a trip over there and really bolstered relations against China. We remember the 72 election, which he won handily, ridiculously. His party had broken into the Democratic headquarters in a building called Watergate in Washington. He didn't do it, but they say he tried to cover it up. he was impeached, but to prevent certain rejection and removal, he decided to exit the presidency, resigning in 1974. So what started out to be a pretty good Nixon presidency ended up, as you know, Watergate, scandal, disgrace, removal from office, and Vice President Ford took over. We should also say it was Nixon who finally brought an end to that long, long Vietnam War. And these two wars, the old Korean War and now the Vietnam War, ended up on the sour side, as we've noted first. Jimmy Carter, who took over winning in 1976, was a longtime Georgia peanut farmer and longtime governor. We remember Jimmy Carter for three things. He was plagued throughout his presidency with inflation, troubled from the oil problems in the Middle East. Also, we remember he got involved in the Iran hostage crisis, where 52 Americans were held hostage in the embassy in Tehran for 444 days, and he didn't do anything about it. He just stayed put. That hurt him. And then we also remember Roe v. Wade, 1973, which hurt him. How? Because he was pro-life and didn't know quite how to handle it, keeping his feelings and that of his party together and in harmony. We remember Jimmy Carter. Poor guy. We remember three things that tends to give him the feeling as a weak president. Now, when Ronald Reagan, the sportscaster, movie star, and governor of California, with his charm, good looks, and all, when he came along winning in 80 and 84, we remember him primarily for ending that Vietnam War, in which Carter had trouble deciding what to do. And we remember him primarily for his standing up to Gorbachev and USSR, telling Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. It came down, and with it, shortly thereafter, the USSR came to an end. Now Reagan didn't cause the dissolution of the USSR, but he reflected it and contributed to it. Ronald Reagan. Quite a story. Next time, we'll see that my little story rubbed elbows and came in contact pretty closely with the big story because of Maryland and my connection to politics.